It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, until the silence of the old mansion was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. Felicie Bault, the young servant, had been talking about someone who wasn't even supposed to exist, but as she whispered about the haunting presence that tormented her from beyond the grave, I realized that this was no ordinary mystery. In a house where the walls held secrets, and the shadows whispered lies, could I really trust my own sanity? The truth was out there, but would I survive long enough to uncover it? The night train rumbled through the snow-covered countryside, its wheels screeching against the tracks like the whispers of forgotten secrets. In a dimly lit first-class compartment, Dr. Lydia Farrow adjusted her shawl, trying to ignore the cold creeping into her bones. Despite her many years of travel, the claustrophobic sense of dread that always accompanied late-night journeys never failed to haunt her. She had seen too much in her time as a psychiatrist, things that twisted the mind in ways both cruel and fascinating. She glanced around at her fellow passengers, noting the occupied corners of the compartment with a feeling of unease. Only one seat remained, beside a man who sat with his back to her, his face hidden in shadow. She noticed the soft glint of his spectacles as he turned toward her. His name was Arthur Hale, another traveler bound for the north. He had an air of quiet mystery about him, but there was something far darker lurking beneath his calm demeanor. "Dr. Farrow, isn't it?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I've heard much about your work, particularly your latest study on the mind's darkest corners." Lydia froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected recognition, especially not in the middle of nowhere. "You're familiar with my research?" she asked, her tone guarded. Hale smiled faintly, his eyes flashing with an unsettling sharpness. "I keep up with the important minds," he said, his gaze flicking to the man across from them, a tall, broad-shouldered fellow who seemed to be lost in thought. "You know Dr. Finch, don't you?" The name caught Lydia off guard. Dr. Edmund Finch was a name she had heard whispered in academic circles, but she had never met him in person. "Of course," she replied carefully, her mind racing. The doctor's controversial theories on psychological manipulation had made waves. Finch's gaze met hers, his face stoic, yet there was something in his eyes, a hint of calculation, that sent a shiver down her spine. "Curious how our paths cross," Dr. Finch murmured, almost as if he was aware of the undercurrent of tension. But it wasn't until Lydia turned her attention to the fourth figure in the compartment that she felt the true weight of danger. A man sat at the far end of the carriage, a thin, pale figure whose eyes gleamed unnaturally bright in the dim light. He didn't move, didn't speak, but there was something about him, something that made Lydia's blood run cold. She couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger knew more than anyone else in the room. And just as the train chugged forward into the night, the lights flickered, and the carriage plunged into an eerie silence. A chill ran through Lydia as she realized that what was supposed to be a peaceful journey had just turned into a dangerous game of secrets and lies. Everyone had something to hide, and she was about to find out just how far they would go to keep their truths buried. The train hummed steadily through the night, but Dr. Evelyn Shaw couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. She had been on countless journeys like this one, yet tonight felt different, almost as if the air itself was thicker, heavier. She sat back in her seat, a book unopened in her lap, and cast a glance across the compartment. The three men around her were a curious blend of intellect and mystery. Sir Raymond Duval, the renowned historian with his sharp, calculating eyes, Professor Thomas Gray, a biologist who always seemed lost in thought, his fingers tapping nervously on the seat arm, and Dr. Isaac Hawke, a psychiatrist who had a reputation for digging too deep into the darkest corners of the mind. "Well, well," said Sir Raymond, breaking the silence with a smirk. "It seems we're quite the assembly, aren't we? The scholar, the scientist, and the mind reader. And what are we missing, Raymond?" Professor Gray chuckled, his voice low and thoughtful. "Perhaps we could do with the perspective of the layman, the common man who sees the world through a different lens." Dr. Hawke leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Ah, but you forget, gentlemen, the layman often holds the most dangerous truths. He is the one who sees not only with his eyes, but with his instincts, the one who knows when something is off." There was a pause, and the tension in the air grew heavier, as if each word added weight to the room. Dr. Shaw felt the shift, the uncomfortable realization that she was not the only one who felt the wrongness of the night. The common man, Sir Raymond muttered, but can he see what's hidden beneath, what's lurking just out of view? He may not see it, Doctor, Hawke said, his voice steady, but with an undertone of something more sinister, but he feels it. We're all driven by the same primal instincts, no matter how much we dress them up with reason. Evelyn's thoughts raced. What are you implying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Doctor, Hawke's smile was cold, almost predatory. I'm implying that there's more to this than meets the eye, and you, my dear Evelyn, have just scratched the surface. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, as her eyes locked onto the fourth occupant of the compartment, an unfamiliar man, seated at the far corner, hidden by shadows. He hadn't spoken a word, but the way he observed the conversation, his stillness, was more unsettling than any word could have been. He was a stranger, silent, enigmatic, and perhaps the key to a mystery far deeper than she could have imagined. As the train continued its journey, the dim light flickered once, then twice, before plunging them into an eerie darkness. The silence in the compartment thickened, the tension palpable. Someone was hiding something, and Evelyn knew, without a doubt, that by the end of this journey, she would be forced to confront a truth far darker than she had anticipated. Dr. Maxwell Heath looked around the dimly lit study, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass of his whiskey tumbler. He'd been having this conversation for years now, pushing the boundaries of accepted thought, questioning the very fabric of what they knew. You've never truly defined it, he said with a sharp edge to his voice, his eyes locking onto each of the men in turn. Not once, in all the years we've had this discussion. The group shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. As if on cue, Professor Wallace Cray cleared his throat, preparing to defend the old paradigms, but Dr. Heath wasn't finished. Is it really a spirit, as you say, or is it something more, something else entirely? His words hung in the air, charged with an unsettling energy. What if it's spirits, multiple, not just one? The question was a challenge, an accusation wrapped in curiosity. Spirits. Wallace raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident, yet there was an underlying unease that he couldn't quite suppress. Yes, Heath pressed, his voice dropping to a whisper. Are we so sure that there's only one presence inhabiting this vessel we call the body? You claim the mind is one thing, rational, controlled, a singular force, but aren't there other influences, just beneath the surface? His gaze swept over them, and he leaned forward, his finger tapping gently on the table, as if urging them to understand. You, Wallace, you're the owner of your body, of your mind, an undisputed king in your realm, but don't you ever feel it? The subtle movements, the moods that shift your behavior, as if a different person temporarily takes control. One moment, calm and collected, then suddenly, something else overtakes you. Anger, fear, desire, all feel as if they belong to someone else, and yet they come from you. You may be the ruler of your own domain, but there are whispers in the shadows, forces you can't quite name, driving you in ways you can't explain. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them all. Wallace remained still, unnervingly quiet, as if considering the possibility that the doctor's theory wasn't as absurd as it had felt. Then the lawyer, Charles Alliston, chuckled nervously. Doctor, you've taken this far too far. You're telling me my mind is a battlefield, riddled with all sorts of conflicting personalities. Doctor merely shrugged, his expression unreadable. Your body, why should the mind be any different? If the body is a battleground, a war zone of cells, organs and processes, why not the mind? The canon, who had remained a passive observer until now, finally spoke up, his voice thick with mock admiration. Ah yes, science, ever the beacon of wonder and discovery. Tell me, Doctor, do you honestly believe our minds are merely haunted by other versions of ourselves? But as the last word left his lips, he couldn't shake the feeling that the question was more than rhetorical, that the doctor had struck a nerve. You'd be surprised, Heath said softly, his eyes gleaming with a knowledge they hadn't quite grasped. And at that moment, as the room seemed to grow colder, more distant, it became clear, whatever the answer was, they weren't prepared for it. Not yet, Doctor. Maxwell Heath leaned back in his chair, a slight smile curling at the corner of his lips, as if he'd just solved a puzzle no one else had seen. I could easily craft an entire sermon around that theory, he mused aloud, his voice laced with irony. But before anyone could respond, Dr. Campbell Clark, who had been waiting for just the right moment, spoke up in his usual dry tone. Speaking of interesting cases, gentlemen, my journey tonight takes me to Newcastle, a fascinating example of dual personality, quite genuine, though neurotic, of course. Sir George Durand, intrigued but cautious, raised an eyebrow. Dual personality, you say? That's not unheard of, I believe. There's often memory loss involved, isn't there? I read something on it in the probate court, only recently. Dr. Clark nodded, the faintest hint of excitement slipping through his professional composure. The classic case, of course. You might remember Felicie Bault. She became something of a legend in France. The room fell silent, as everyone leaned in, eager for more. Felicie had no less than 4 distinct personalities, each one marked with a number. Felicie 1, Felicie 2, Felicie 3, and so on. Canon Parfitt, who had been watching the discussion with mild curiosity, spoke up. I remember reading about that in the papers, but that must have been years ago, 7 at least. Dr. Clark's gaze sharpened, as he nodded. It's been some time, yes, but the case is still relevant. Felicie's story drew scientists from across the globe. Her personalities were so distinct, so believable, that people were both fascinated and terrified. But of course, the final 2, Felicie 3 and 4, were questioned. There were rumors of deception, of her playing the system. Sir George frowned. Deception? Could it have been some sort of trick? Dr. Clark's eyes grew distant for a moment, lost in thought. Possibly, but the main facts hold. Felicie Bault was the 3rd of 5 children, born to a tragic family in Brittany. Her father, a violent drunk, murdered her mother in a fit of rage. Felicie was only 5 at the time. The father was sent away for life, and Felicie, along with her siblings, was taken in by a charitable English lady, who ran an orphanage. Despite her efforts, Felicie struggled with everything. She was slow to learn, clumsy with her hands, and unable to grasp even basic lessons. But there was something more, something hidden beneath her slow exterior. What the English lady didn't know was that Felicie was hiding something darker, something that would unravel the very fabric of her mind and her identity. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs, now fell into a heavy silence, as if the mere mention of Felicie's name had cast a shadow over the entire gathering. Dr. Clark's words had left a lingering chill in the air, a feeling that there was far more to this story than anyone could have imagined. Miss Helena Slater had tried her best to mold Felicie into a proper servant, finding her various domestic positions as she grew older, yet each attempt ended in failure. Her inability to grasp the simplest tasks, coupled with an overwhelming apathy towards work, led her to abandon each job sooner than anyone could have anticipated. Clark paused for a moment, watching the reactions around him, his voice softening slightly as he continued. There is a photograph of Felicie at the age of 17. In it she appears nothing more than a sluggish peasant girl, clumsy and unremarkable, with an imposing frame that spoke nothing of the future she would unknowingly shape for herself. The canon, shifting in his seat, suddenly became aware of a shift in Dr. Clark's demeanor. His previously closed eyes now flickered open, and a faint, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. It was a subtle change, but it did not go unnoticed. The canon, sensing something far more sinister at play, felt his unease grow as the doctor continued. 5 years later, Felicie Bault, by then 22, fell ill with a strange nervous condition. When she recovered, it was as though she had been reborn. The transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. Experts from across the world could not deny the facts. Felicie 1, the girl they had known for so long, was but a shadow of the woman who emerged after her illness. He went on, recounting the shifts in Felicie's personality with an unsettling calmness. Felicie 1, before her illness, could barely form a coherent sentence in French, let alone speak another language. Her handwriting was clumsy, her thoughts disjointed, yet Felicie 2, after the illness, was a different entity entirely. Fluent in Italian and German, she wrote with grace, and her mastery of French was poetic. Politics, art, literature, she conversed on them all as though she had lived 1,000 lives, and as for music, Felicie too had an undeniable passion for the piano, a skill that had eluded Felicie I. Then there was Felicie III, who shared many traits with Felicie II, but also possessed a peculiar sharpness that seemed almost calculating. What had caused this drastic shift? Was it truly the illness, or was something far darker at play? The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the doctor's unsettling gaze. His words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore, and with each sentence, the mystery of Felicie Bault seemed to grow deeper, more complex. Was she merely a victim of circumstance, or was there something more sinister buried within her fractured mind? The truth, it seemed, was just beyond reach, yet tantalizingly close. Felicie's transformation was nothing short of baffling. Once a simple peasant girl, she now possessed an intelligence and refinement that seemed almost incongruous with her origins. Yet, beneath this newfound education, there lurked a moral abyss. Felicie's personality, once fragile and naive, had splintered into something far darker and more troubling. As Felicie II, she spoke with an elegance that charmed even the most cultured individuals, but when the personality shifted to Felicie III, her language became vile, filled with profanities and blasphemous rants against religion and morality. She knew the Parisian underworld better than most, and could talk the language of the chic demi-monde with unsettling ease, but it was Felicie IV that truly fascinated and disturbed those around her. This persona was meek, seemingly half-witted, and strangely pious, claiming to possess clairvoyant abilities. Yet, there was something off about Felicie IV, as if it were a cruel joke played by Felicie III herself, a persona that seemed to mock the public's gullibility. The most unsettling aspect of these transformations was their complete unpredictability. Each personality emerged without warning, and when they did, there was no recognition of the others. Felicie II would dominate for days, sometimes weeks, while the others barely had a moment to surface. The shifts in her identity were marked by agonizing headaches and long periods of sleep, during which she seemed to lose all memory of the other selves. It was as though each personality inhabited a separate world, and once one left, it took all memories with it, leaving nothing but an empty space. As Dr. Campbell Clark spoke, his tone steady, there was an undeniable sense of mystery that clung to his words. The canon, ever the skeptic, murmured in awe, "Remarkable, truly remarkable. It is as though we're only scratching the surface of a deeper truth." But the lawyer, with a cold smile, interjected, "Remarkable, yes, but don't be so quick to dismiss the possibility of deception. There are those who prey upon such wonders." Dr. Clark was quick to respond, his voice tight with a hint of tension. The case was thoroughly investigated, both by medical professionals and lawyers. Felicie Bault was no simple case, and the truth, I assure you, was anything but ordinary. As the words lingered in the air, a chill seemed to settle over the room. Was this truly a matter of mental illness, or was something far more sinister at play? The answers seemed just out of reach, tantalizingly close, yet impossible to grasp. Remember, Maitre Quimbellier's investigation was thorough, Dr. Campbell Clark continued, his voice steady, and it confirmed the findings of the scientists. But why should we be so surprised? We encounter anomalies in nature every day. Double-yolked eggs, twin bananas. Why not the double soul within a single body? The canon's brow furrowed at the notion of a double soul, his disbelief apparent. Dr. Clark's piercing blue eyes locked onto him, his gaze unwavering. What else can we call it if not that? After all, if the personality is a reflection of the soul, then why not consider the possibility of two souls within one? Sir George, always the pragmatist, interjected with a dry chuckle. Thank goodness such a condition is rare, or it would create a world of complications. Dr. Clark nodded solemnly. Indeed, it's abnormal, but one must remember that the opportunity for further study was tragically cut short by Felicie's untimely death. The lawyer, never one to let a peculiar detail slide, added, I recall something rather strange about her death. Wasn't there something off about it? Dr. Clark's face grew more serious. Yes, it was baffling. Felicie was found dead in her bed, strangled, yet, The shocking revelation came soon after she had strangled herself. The marks on her neck were unmistakably her own fingers. A suicide, though physically possible, would have required inhuman strength and willpower. What drove her to such an extreme remains a mystery to this day. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The curtain has fallen on the case of Felicie Bault, Dr. Clark concluded, his voice low. It was then that the man in the far corner of the room stirred, his presence unnoticed until that moment. He had remained so still, so silent, that the others had almost forgotten he was there. His laugh, sharp and unsettling, sliced through the tension. The three men jumped, startled. "Forgive me, gentlemen," the man said, his voice smooth and deliberate, with a foreign lilt. He sat up, revealing a pale face, marked by a small dark mustache. "But truly, in science, can we ever truly say the last word has been spoken?" He spoke with a mocking bow, as though savoring the mystery he had just stirred. Dr. Clark, ever the professional, regarded him with mild curiosity. "You know something about this case?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious. The stranger's smile widened ever so slightly, his eyes glinting with secrets as yet untold. The atmosphere in the room thickened, the air crackling with a new tension. Something was about to change. "Of the case, no. But I knew her," the man replied, his tone cool, unruffled by the intensity of the conversation. "Felicie Bault?" the doctor asked, his voice steady, but with an edge of curiosity. The man nodded slowly, his lips curling into a slight smile. "Yes, and Annette Ravel too. You haven't heard of Annette Ravel, have you? Yet, the story of Felicie Bault cannot be understood without first knowing the history of Annette Ravel." He glanced at his watch, as though measuring time. "Half an hour until our next stop. I have time to tell you the story, if you care to hear it." The doctor, intrigued, nodded for him to continue, while the canon voiced his eagerness. Sir George remained silent, his posture attentive and intent. The stranger settled back in his seat, and began his tale. "My name is Raoul Letardo. You mentioned Miss Slater earlier, the Englishwoman involved in charity work. It was she who, after my parents were killed in a railway accident, saved me from being sent to an English workhouse. I was just a child then, one of 20 in her care, all of us from broken homes, or worse. Amongst those children were Felicie Bault and Annette Ravel. If I cannot make you understand Annette, then I fear you will understand nothing. She was the daughter of what you would call a fille de joie, a woman who died of consumption after being abandoned by her lover. Her mother had been a dancer, and Annette, too, had inherited that same burning desire to dance. Raoul's voice softened, as though lost in the past. "When I first saw Annette, she was just 11, a small fiery creature, with eyes that could both mock and promise in a single glance, and from the very first moment, she made me her slave. It was always Raoul, do this, Raoul, do that, and I, like an idiot, obeyed. I worshipped her, and she knew it. She had that power over me. We would walk down to the shore together, Felicie and I trailing behind. Annette would kick off her shoes and stockings, and dance on the sand, her body moving with a grace that seemed too mature for her age. Then, breathless from her exertion, she would sit and tell us of her grand ambitions. "See, one day, I will be famous," she would say, "exceedingly famous. I'll have all the finest silk stockings, the most luxurious things, and when I dance, I'll be the star of Paris. People will go mad, screaming and cheering, and when the winters come, I won't be dancing. I'll go south, to a villa surrounded by orange trees. I'll lie in the sun on silk cushions, eating oranges, and I'll never forget you, Raoul. No matter how rich or famous I become, I'll make sure your career takes off too. But Felicie, she'll be my maid, though her hands are too clumsy." Raoul paused, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. Annette's dreams were as vast as her will, and as captivating as the dance she longed to perfect. "Look at her hands," Annette would sneer, her voice dripping with mockery. "How large and coarse they are." Felicie's face would flush with anger, her fists clenching, but Annette, enjoying the power, would taunt her firmly. "Oh Felicie, you're so ladylike, so elegant, so refined, a princess in disguise. Ha!" The biting words would cut deeper than any physical blow, and Felicie, though visibly seething, would bite back with words of her own. "My parents were married. unlike yours." Her words were laced with venom. Annette, unfazed, would respond with a cold smile. "Yes, but your father killed your mother. How charming, to be the daughter of a murderer." And with that, the air would grow thick with tension, the two women locked in their silent war. Felicie's retort would come like a growl. "Your father left your mother to die alone." Annette, for once, would fall silent, her eyes distant. "Poor Mama," she would mutter, a hint of something deeper flickering in her gaze. "One must stay strong to stay alive." Felicie, ever the boastful one, would retort proudly, "I am as strong as a horse." And indeed, her physical strength surpassed any other girl at the home. She never fell ill, never seemed to tire. But her mind, Raoul observed, was a different matter. Felicie was not the sharpest tool in the shed. She followed Annette like a shadow, and Raoul often wondered if, deep down, she hated her tormentor. Annette wasn't kind to Felicie, far from it. She mocked her slowness, her simple-mindedness, and would taunt her relentlessly in front of the others, leaving Felicie seething with rage. Raoul had seen the fire in her eyes, the clenched fists, and sometimes he feared that Felicie might one day snap and strangle Annette, her overpowering strength eclipsing her inability to keep up with Annette's sharp tongue. Over time, however, Felicie had learned to retaliate in the one way she knew would wound Annette. She had discovered Annette's weakness, the envy she felt for Felicie's physical prowess, and so Felicie would strike, each word aimed to hit Annette, where she was most vulnerable. One day, Annette, bubbling with excitement, approached Raoul. "We shall have fun with Felicie today. She's so stupid. Watch, we'll laugh ourselves to death." Curiosity piqued, Raoul followed Annette to the back of a shed, where she revealed her plan. Annette had gotten her hands on a strange book, one on hypnotism, though much of it was beyond her understanding. "You see," Annette explained, "they say a bright object will do the trick." I made Felicie stare at the brass knob on my bed, made her look at it steadily. Her voice lowered, almost with a sense of dread. "Raoul, I was scared." Her eyes, they looked so strange, so vacant. I told her, "Felicie, you will do everything I say." And she answered, "I will do everything you say." And a chill passed through Raoul's as he remembered the cold, empty look in Felicie's eyes. He had always known Annette was dangerous, but he had no idea just how deep her power could go. And then Annette's voice was tinged with excitement. "Tomorrow Felicie will take a tallow candle into the playground at 12 o'clock, and she'll start eating it. When anyone asks her, she'll say it's the best galette she's ever tasted. Can you imagine, Raoul? Think of the fun we'll have." Her eyes gleamed as she spoke, the thrill of the upcoming spectacle filling her. I, of course, was skeptical. "She'll never do that." "It's ridiculous," I said, but Annette waved off my objections. "The book says it will work. I don't quite believe it either, but oh, if it does, just think how we'll amuse ourselves." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and though I had my doubts, the idea did seem rather amusing. So we spread the word to the others, and by noon the next day the playground was buzzing with anticipation. Felicie, to our amazement, appeared exactly on time, a stump of candle in her hand. I watched, barely able to contain my laughter, as she began nibbling at it, solemnly, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. The other children couldn't hold back, and one by one they approached her, asking, "Is it good what you're eating, Felicie?" She would look at them, blink in her usual confused way, and answer, "But yes, it is the best galette I've ever tasted." Each response sent us into fits of giggles, the laughter echoing through the playground. But it wasn't long before Felicie's face began to change. Her puzzled expression deepened, and she looked from the candle to us, her hand moving to her forehead in confusion. "What am I doing?" she muttered to herself. At that moment we screamed in unison, "You're eating a candle." The words hit her like a cold splash of water. Annette, practically dancing with delight, crowed, "I made you do it, Felicie. I made you do it." But Felicie didn't laugh. Her eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flickering in them. "So it's you," she said slowly, her voice chillingly calm. "It's you who made me look like a fool. I remember now." And then with a terrifying quietness, she added, "I will kill you for this." The air thickened with tension, as Annette, suddenly realizing the depth of her mistake, shrieked and bolted behind me for protection. "Save me, Raoul. I didn't mean it. It was just a joke." Felicie's eyes burned with fury. "I do not like jokes," she spat. "I hate you. I hate you all." And then, in a sudden explosive rush of emotion, she broke down crying, her entire body racked with sobs as she fled the scene. Annette, no longer so confident, stood frozen, clearly shaken by the intensity of Felicie's reaction. For a time Annette did not dare repeat her cruel game, but from that day forward, a strange dynamic took hold. Felicie, though she loathed Annette with every fiber of her being, found herself inexplicably drawn to her. It was as though Annette's power over her had grown even more insidious. Felicie began to follow her like a shadow, unable to resist, despite the resentment burning within her. The tension between them crackled in the air, a dangerous undercurrent that none of us could ignore. Soon after that, messieurs, my life took a different turn. Employment was found for me, and I came to the home only during occasional holidays. Annette, on the other hand, was determined to pursue her dreams, though her aspiration to become a dancer was quickly dismissed. However, as time passed, a new talent emerged. Annette developed an enchanting voice, one that captivated anyone who heard. Miss Slater, recognizing her potential, agreed to train her as a singer. She was relentless in her work, pushing herself beyond limits, and it was clear she was no longer the carefree girl I once knew. Miss Slater, ever concerned for her, once confided in me, "You've always been fond of Annette. Please persuade her to rest. She's been coughing lately, and I'm worried." Life pulled me away, and soon I found myself traveling far from home. Initially, Annette sent letters, but as the years passed, the silence grew. 5 years later, when I returned to Paris, I saw her face again on a poster, the very same one that had once been part of her dreams. The poster drew me in, and that evening, I went to see her perform. Annette had become a sensation. Her voice, flawless in French and Italian, commanded the stage. Afterward, I made my way to her dressing room, where she greeted me with open arms. "Raoul," she exclaimed, her hands stretched out in greeting, her voice full of warmth and triumph. "It's been so long. Where have you been all these years?" I wanted to tell her everything, but the truth was, she wasn't really interested in hearing about my life. "I'm almost there," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Look at me now. The good Miss Slater must be proud of how far I've come." Her words were sharp, dismissing the woman who had once guided her. That old woman, she only wanted me for the conservatoire. But I am an artist. I need more than just a proper concert singer's life. The variety stage, Raoul, that's where I truly belong. As she spoke, a man entered the room, a distinguished middle-aged figure, who carried himself with an air of authority. His presence was unmistakable, and it quickly became clear that he was her protector, someone who had been by her side through it all. As I turned to leave, the man gave me a fleeting glance, a look that spoke volumes without uttering a word. Annette, ever the performer, quickly filled the silence. "A friend from my childhood," she said with a playful smile, her voice light but laced with an undertone I couldn't ignore. "He saw my face on a poster, and here we are." The man, polished and charming, wasted no time. She reached into his pocket, and with a flourish, presented a stunning ruby and diamond bracelet. He clasped it around Annette's wrist with delicate care, as though the gesture was as natural as breathing. As I stood to leave, Annette threw me one last look, a look full of triumph, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and something darker. "I've made it, haven't I?" she whispered, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "All the world is at my feet now, Raoul, can you see it?" But as I made my way toward the door, I caught it, a dry, rattling cough, sharp and persistent, a cough I knew too well, the same cough that had plagued her mother, and now, it seemed, was claiming Annette in its ruthless grasp. 2 years passed before I saw her again, though what I found was hardly the Annette I remembered. She had sought refuge with Miss Slater, her once promising career shattered, her body ravaged by illness, was no longer the vibrant figure I had once known. The doctors, in their cold, factual manner, offered no hope. "There is nothing to be done," they said, as though her fate had already been sealed. I found her in the garden, a pale shadow of the woman she had been. She was kept outdoors, day and night, as though the fresh air could somehow save her. Her cheeks were sunken, her eyes wild with fever, and her body trembled with each painful cough. She greeted me, not with joy, but with a raw, desperate energy that sent a chill down my spine. "Raoul," she said, her voice trembling, "they say I may not recover. They whisper behind my back, but they are wrong. I will not die. Not yet. Life is still waiting for me." Her words were a desperate plea, a denial of the inevitable. "You hear that, Raoul? I'm getting better. I feel it. I know it." She raised herself on her elbows, her frail body trembling with effort, as if willing her own recovery into existence. But then just as quickly, she fell back, gripped by a violent coughing fit that shook her to the core. "It's just a cough," she gasped. "The blood, it's nothing. You see, I'll show them all. I will surprise them." Her eyes burned with feverish determination. "The will to live, that's what matters. I'm not like those who give up. I won't be one of the weak ones. I'm going to live." The scene was heartbreaking, pitiful, and yet in her eyes, there was something terrifying, a refusal to accept reality. In that moment, Felicie Bault entered the scene, carrying a tray with a glass of warm milk. She approached Annette with a look that was almost too calm, too knowing. She handed Annette the milk, watching her sip it with an unreadable expression. There was something unsettling in Felicie's gaze, something almost satisfied. Annette, ever aware of the tension, caught the look, and in a fit of anger, hurled the glass across the room. It shattered on the floor. "You see that?" Annette spat, her voice thick with disdain. "She's glad I'm dying. She's relishing it. Look at her, healthy, strong, and all she does is gloat. She thinks I'm a fool, but I'm not." Her voice was bitter, filled with a hatred that I hadn't expected. What good is her perfect health? What's the use of her body when it's just an empty shell? Felicie, undeterred by Annette's outburst, calmly bent down and began picking up the shards of glass. Her voice was as sweet as syrup, though her words were venomous. "I don't care what she says," Felicie replied with a sing-song tone. "I'm a respectable girl, you know. As for her, she's going to pay for her sins. Purgatory awaits her. I'm a Christian. I don't say anything, but God knows the truth." Her words hung in the air, thick with malice, as she continued to clean up the mess, her eyes never leaving Annette's fragile form. The room, once filled with the sweet illusions of success, was now a battleground, one where survival, jealousy and unspoken resentment collided in a deadly dance. Annette's voice, cold yet tinged with a strange thrill, cut through the tension in the room. "You hate me, don't you?" she cried out, her words sharp like a knife. "You've always hated me, haven't you? But I can make you do whatever I want. Watch and see." She looked directly at Felicie, with a mixture of amusement and something darker behind her eyes. "If I asked you right now to kneel before me, you would, wouldn't you? Right here on the grass, you'd kneel for me." Felicie's discomfort was palpable, her gaze flickering nervously. "You think me absurd, don't you?" Annette continued, her voice dripping with mockery. "But deep down you know you will. You will do it to please me." The room grew silent for a moment, the weight of Annette's words sinking in. "Kneel, Felicie, kneel for me," Annette commanded again, her tone laced with a hypnotic force. Something in the air shifted, and Felicie, as though caught in some strange trance, slowly lowered herself to her knees. Her face, once full of defiance, now vacant, almost as though her will had been stripped away, stared ahead without emotion. Annette leaned back, her laugh erupting like a storm, sharp and wild, filling the space with an unsettling echo. "Look at her, how ridiculous she looks," Annette sneered, her eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "You can get up now." "Felicie, thank you for showing me your obedience. You may leave now." Felicie, still under the weight of whatever spell Annette had woven, silently rose and retreated, picking up the shattered remnants of the glass she had thrown earlier. But as she turned to leave, there was a flicker of something dark in her eyes, resentment, smoldering like an ember waiting to ignite. The air in the room was thick with tension, as though the ground beneath them was shifting, and no one knew what disaster might come next. Months passed, and the news of Annette's death came as a shock, though not entirely unexpected. She had fought death like a cornered animal, gasping for air and desperately repeating, "I will not die. Do you hear me? I will live, live." no matter what. Her determination had been as fierce as it had been futile, and yet the inevitable had happened. When I finally visited Miss Slater, months later, she spoke of it with sorrowful empathy. "Poor Raoul," she said softly, her voice holding a gentleness that contrasted with the chaos that had unfolded. "You loved her, didn't you?" "Always," I replied, my voice thick with the weight of memories, but it was no use. There was nothing I could do for her. She was full of life, brilliant, burning with it, until the end. Miss Slater sighed deeply, before changing the subject. "I've been worried about Felicie," she continued, her tone now edged with concern. "She's been different ever since Annette's passing. It's as though she's not the same person anymore. A kind of breakdown," they said. "She's changed." There was a moment of hesitation before Miss Slater spoke again, as though uncertain whether to continue. "You know, Felicie's learning to play the piano now." The words hit me like a blow. Felicie, learning the piano. The girl who had never shown any talent, who I had always thought of as simple-minded, now had some inexplicable gift. "They say she's good at it," Miss Slater added, her voice tinged with bewilderment, "but I never imagined it. Felicie, playing the piano. I always thought she was, well, you know." The silence hung heavy in the room, as I tried to make sense of it all. The girl who had once been so plain and forgettable now had an unexpected skill, one that I couldn't quite understand. Something strange was happening here, something deeper than just a sudden change in her behavior. The pieces were beginning to shift, and the mystery was only just beginning to unfold. I nodded slowly, still unsure of what to make of Felicie's strange behavior. "She's so odd in her manner sometimes," I confessed. "I really don't know how to understand her." A few moments later I found myself walking into the salle de lecture, where the sound of a piano filled the air. It was Felicie, sitting at the piano playing a haunting melody, the same one I had once heard Annette sing in Paris. The realization hit me hard. My heart skipped a beat, the familiarity of the tune a cruel reminder of the past. Then, as though sensing my presence, Felicie abruptly stopped playing, turning her gaze toward me. Her eyes, once dull and unremarkable, were now sharp, full of mockery, and a strange, unnerving intelligence. For a brief moment, I was shaken, unable to comprehend what was unfolding in front of me. She smirked and said, "Tiens, so it's you, Monsieur Raoul." The way she said it was unlike anything I had heard before. Annette had always addressed me as Raoul, but Felicie, since we'd grown up, had always been formal, calling me Monsieur Raoul. Now, however, the monsieur carried a weight, a peculiar emphasis that made it sound almost comical, as though she found some hidden amusement in it. "Why, Felicie," I stammered, taken aback, you look different today." She paused, as if reflecting on my words. "Do I?" she said, her tone playful yet unsettling. "That's odd, isn't it? But don't be so serious, Raoul. I'll call you Raoul, as I always did when we were children. Life is for laughter, after all." She let out a light, almost mocking laugh, and then, as though the conversation had grown tiresome, she casually remarked, "Let's talk about poor Annette, dead and buried now. Do you think she's in purgatory, perhaps, or somewhere else?" With that she hummed a fragment of a song, her voice off-key, but the words lingered in my mind. "Felicie," I blurted, stunned by the sudden thought, "do you speak Italian?" Her eyes glinted with mischief as she looked at me. "Why not, Raoul? I'm not as stupid as I like to pretend." She laughed again, watching my confusion with evident delight. "I don't understand," I murmured, still processing the bizarre shift in her behavior. "But I'll explain it to you," she said, leaning in with an air of secrecy. "I'm quite the actress, you know, though no one suspects it. I can play many parts, and play them very well." She laughed again, a sound that sent a chill down my spine, before swiftly darting out of the room, leaving me unable to stop her. When I saw her again, she was asleep in an armchair, her breathing deep and heavy. For a moment I stood there, mesmerized by the sight, yet a part of me felt repelled, as if I were watching something unnatural. Suddenly she jerked awake, her eyes clouded and lifeless as they met mine. "Monsieur Raoul," she muttered, her voice mechanical, as though she had slipped into a trance. "Yes, Felicie," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm leaving now. The unease that gripped me only deepened. There was something terribly wrong with Felicie, something far more unsettling than I had ever imagined. "Will you play for me again before I go?" I asked, my voice hesitating as the words left my lips. I had a feeling this would be a moment I would not soon forget. Felicie looked at me with a cold, unreadable gaze. Her eyes narrowed in disdain, and her lips twisted into a subtle but unsettling smirk. "Play? You mock me, Monsieur Raoul," she retorted, her voice laced with something darker than sarcasm, perhaps fear, or something even more unsettling. I was taken aback, but I pressed on, trying to remind her of the morning's performance, a light-hearted moment. "But you played for me earlier today," I said, hoping to make her smile once more, to return to that innocent moment. She shook her head slowly, as though the memory had vanished into the ether, leaving no trace behind. "Play? How could a poor girl like me play?" Her words held an edge now, and the air around us grew heavier, colder, as though a storm were brewing just beyond the room's walls. She paused for a long moment, her face becoming a mask of thoughtfulness, and then she beckoned me closer, her eyes darting nervously around, as though to ensure no one could overhear. "Monsieur Raoul, there are strange things happening in this house," she said quietly, her voice trembling just enough for me to hear. "It plays tricks on you, you know, the clocks they change." Yes, I know what I'm saying, and it's all her doing." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt an inexplicable sense of unease wash over me. "Who's doing?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper, not daring to break the fragile silence that had descended between us. Her eyes grew wide, the terror in them now unmistakable. "Annette's," she answered with a venom that dripped from her tongue. "That wicked one's. When she was alive, she tormented me. Now that she's dead, she comes back, haunting me, tormenting me still." I stared at her, utterly confused. Annette? Who was she? I had heard nothing of this name before, and yet Felicie's fear was palpable, the kind of terror that only arises from a deep, unshakable belief in something far beyond the ordinary. Her eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "She is bad, Raoul," she whispered urgently. "She would take everything from you, your food, your clothes, your very soul. She is capable of anything. She is not like us. She's a force of darkness, and she will consume us all, one by one." Her voice wavered on the edge of hysteria, her grip tightening on my sleeve, as if to hold herself together. I could barely breathe, caught in her spiraling panic. Her words were nonsensical, yet there was something so desperate about her that I couldn't dismiss them as mere ramblings. "I'm afraid, I tell you, afraid." I hear her voice, but not in my ear. "No, it's here." She tapped her forehead with trembling fingers, and I could feel the unease creeping into my own mind. "She's going to drive me away, drive me completely mad. What will I do then? What will become of me?" Her voice reached a breaking point, rising in volume and pitch until it bordered on a shriek. The air in the room thickened, and I felt trapped, suffocating under the weight of her terror, and then, as if some invisible switch had been flipped, she suddenly smiled, a strange, unsettling smile. It was no longer the delicate, fragile smile I had seen before, but something far more devious and cunning. It was the smile of a peasant, yes, but with something dark beneath it, something that made my skin crawl. "If it comes to it, Monsieur Raoul," she said, her voice calm now, too calm, "I am very strong with my hands, very strong." The shift in her tone was jarring, and I felt a deep instinctive sense of dread creeping into my bones. I had never paid much attention to her hands before, but now, with those words hanging in the air, I couldn't help but look. What I saw made my stomach turn. Her fingers were squat and brutal, like gnarled roots of an old tree, and her grip, God, her grip, was terrifying. I had no doubt that those hands could crush bone and sinew with ease. I shuddered, turning away from her, unable to look at her any more. The nausea that surged through me was so strong that I had to steady myself against the wall. I couldn't shake the image of those hands from my mind, the hands of a murderer, the hands that perhaps had once strangled her mother. That thought alone was enough to make my stomach churn, and my knees weak. It was as if I could hear the echoes of past violence in the room, the ghosts of a history I had no desire to understand. That, I realized, was the last time I would ever see Felicie Bault. Soon after, I left for South America, seeking an escape from the darkness that had begun to cloud my every thought. 2 years later, I returned, only to read in the papers of her sudden and mysterious death. And now tonight, I hear the fuller story from you, gentlemen. The details of Felicie 3 and Felicie 4, so much left unsaid. The train's engine began to slow, the rhythmic sound of the wheels against the tracks almost deafening in the stillness of the compartment. The man in the corner, who had been quiet up until now, sat up straighter, his overcoat buttoned tightly against the creeping chill. "What's your theory?" the lawyer asked, leaning forward with keen interest, his face illuminated by the dim light of the carriage. But before Raoul could answer, Canon Parfit's voice broke in, his words laced with disbelief. "I can hardly believe." He stopped abruptly, as if realizing the magnitude of what was being said. The doctor, meanwhile, remained silent, his gaze fixed intently on Raoul Lepardo, as if he were studying the man, weighing his every word. "The clothes from your back, the soul from your body," Raoul quoted lightly, his tone almost mocking. He stood up suddenly, his movements deliberate and slow. "Gentlemen, I say to you that the history of Felicie Bault is the same as the history of Annette Raoul. You didn't know her, but I did. She loved life, you see. She thrived on it, soaked it in like a sponge." His voice carried a chilling finality, as he moved toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. "But life is fickle, isn't it? Sometimes it takes a turn for the worse, and before you know it, you're caught in a web of your own making." Raoul's hand gripped the door, ready to leave, but then he stopped, turning back sharply. With a swift motion, he bent down and tapped Canon Parfit lightly on the chest. "Miss le Doctor," Raoul said, his voice dripping with irony, "earlier you said something interesting." With his hand, he pressed against the canon's stomach, the old man flinching at the unexpected contact. "If you find a burglar in your house, what do? Shoot him, don't you?" The canon's face drained of color, his expression shifting from disbelief to a nervous laugh. "No," he said, flustered, "no, not in this country." His words trailed off, but Raoul didn't wait for an answer. With a swift motion, the door banged shut, and the train was once again engulfed in silence. The three men remained, motionless, staring at the empty space where Raoul had just been, his words lingering in the air like a poisoned thread. The tension was unbearable, and no one spoke. The silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, and the carriage felt colder, darker, as if the shadows themselves had come alive.